Hello, welcome to today's webcast, brought to you by Compliance Week and Hyperproof. I'm Aaron Nicodemus with Compliance Week, and I'll be your host. Today's webcast is IPO prep and SOX compliance. Instacart and Armanino LLP share hard-earned knowledge. Before we hear from our presenters, let me review the agenda. We're scheduled to go for an hour. After the presentation, we'll have a question and answer session. Your questions will be kept confidential and anonymous, so please don't be shy. You can ask your questions at any time using the Ask a Question function on the left-hand side of your screen, and I'll pose them to our guests at the end of the presentation. After the Q&A, I'll wrap up the webcast. This webcast will also offer CPE credit for all attendees. Please be sure you are using either Google Chrome or Firefox as your internet browser, and you have disabled your pop-up blockers in order to ensure access to the exam. Once I have signed off and the webcast is completely over, the final examination will be presented automatically in a separate window. If you have trouble viewing the CPE test or receiving the CPE certificate, please send an email to webcasts@complianceweek.com. Once again, to ensure receipt of your CPE credit, please be sure you are using either Google Chrome or Firefox as your internet browser. If you've missed anything, I'll repeat these instructions at the end of the webcast, so stay tuned. A few other administrative details. At any time during the presentation, listeners can download the slides from the drop-down menu on the left-hand side of your screen. There you will find the feedback form for the webcast. We welcome your thoughts as we are always looking to improve your experience. If you wish to increase the slide size, hit View Slide Full Screen button on the top right of your screen. And lastly, the Help button is located in the upper right-hand corner of your screen for assistance. I'd like to welcome today's speakers. It's my pleasure to introduce Todd Bishop, partner in Armanino's Risk Assurance and Advisory Services practice. Todd helps lead the firm's SOX, internal audit, and SOC audit teams. He has more than 22 years of audit and consulting experience in both Big Four public accounting and industry, and his diverse background enables him to bring clients perspectives centered on relevant experience, practical solutions, and empathy for the challenges they face. We also have Terry O'Daniel, who leads governance, risk, and compliance within infrastructure engineering at Instacart. Drawing on his background in engineering and security, Terry builds teams that are focused on applying technology to solve GRC problems at scale via automation and instrumentation rather than compliance by spreadsheet. I'd also like to welcome Aidan Collins, Head of Enterprise Business at Hyperproof, the leading provider of compliance operations software solutions. In his role, he works with organizations to operationalize the complex requirements of a range of compliance frameworks. Aidan has built and led professional services teams at organizations including Deloitte, PwC, and Bain. It's great to have you all with us. And with that, I will turn it over to Aidan to get us started.
Thank you, Aaron, and once again, welcome everybody. We're glad that you're here. We have a full agenda, so let's get right into it. Let me cover what we'll be addressing today. We'll spend a few minutes on a background on SOX. Likely many of you are familiar with that, so consider this a refresher. There'll be lots of good detail in there and included in the slides as you get them afterwards. But we want to move then rapidly into what do you do with that? How do you get ready? What are the activities that you can start to work on? And so the latter part of our presentation will focus a lot on actionable items related to getting ready for an IPO or other kind of exit event, working on what you need to put in place to build a plan related to SOX controls. A key element of that is what can be automated. And we're looking forward to hearing from Terry with some of the work that he's been doing at Instacart and some of the clients that Todd's been working at and talking about what they're seeing in terms of automation and technology support for building those control processes. And then we'll wrap up around a focus related to how do we use technology to increase the efficiency when managing that compliance work and leave some time at the end for questions and answers. With that, I'm going to ask Todd to lead us in a brief summary of what the law around SOX is and what we can expect as we move forward with it. Todd, over to you.
Thanks, Aidan. Good morning, everyone. Great to be here today. As Aidan said, we'll just cover a quick background for you on SOX. The law was passed in 2002 and it took effect in 2004. It impacted both public companies as well as external audit firms in terms of setting requirements around evaluating internal controls, both internally by management as well as by the external audit firms. Most of you probably know the law was passed in response to several high-profile scandals in the accounting world for public companies, Enron, WorldCom, and Tyco, so both accounting fraud as well as governance failures around misappropriation of assets. I want to move to the next slide, Aidan. Wanted to just define a few key terms for you so that as we're talking about the compliance requirements throughout the webinar, you're familiar with what we mean. When we think about the requirements for evaluating controls, disclosure controls and procedures refer to the controls that management would have in place to ensure that all their SEC filings are complete and accurate and fairly presented. And internal control over financial reporting, which is one of the primary components of SOX, refers to those controls that you have in place to ensure that your accounting is complete and accurate. On this slide, we're just breaking down some of the key components of the law. And when you hear these numbers, it's really just referring to the section of the law. There are a couple certification requirements for management, Section 302 and Section 906. 302 is management acknowledging their responsibility and certifying both their disclosure controls and procedures and their internal control over financial reporting. Section 906 is the certification with respect to potential criminal penalties for intentionally filing fraudulent statements or misleading investors. Section 404 is really the brunt of what we refer to when we talk about SOX. This is both management's assessment. So when we say Section 404A, that is where management is evaluating its own internal controls and issuing a report on their conclusions in the 10K, their annual filing. And then Section 404B refers to the external audit requirement. Only certain public companies are subject to Section 404B. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But Section 404B is where the external auditor actually issues an opinion on the control environment at their client.
Todd, can you talk a little bit about what year one and subsequent years look like?
Yeah, so I think that when a company goes public, right, there's a little bit of nuance between a traditional IPO and what we're hearing a lot about now in the marketplace, SPAC reverse mergers, or what, if you're not familiar with that, a special purpose acquisition corporation, essentially a shell corp. So we'll come back to the distinction between those two scenarios in a minute, but for now, I'll just talk about the traditional IPO route. In year one, a newly public company is not yet subject to SOX. They get a reprieve on both Section 404A and 404B that year that they go public. So their first 10K does not need to include management's report on internal control, and they would not be subject to the external audit of internal control. What they do still have to be responsible for is the certifications I talked about. So even though you're not issuing a report on internal control in that first year, management will be certifying under Section 302 and 906 in their 10K. In that year one, management should ultimately get started with evaluating readiness, obviously, and ideally they'd be doing that before they go public. In year two, they will be subject, all public companies are subject to Section 404A. So there's a little bit of confusion around certain filing status that exempts companies from Section 404B, and some folks think that that means that they won't be subject to 404A. But all public companies do need to evaluate their internal control and issue a report on their internal control. As I said before, not all public companies are subject to Section 404B for the external audit. I alluded to the distinction between a traditional IPO and a SPAC reverse merger a moment ago, and this is really an important distinction when thinking about your compliance roadmap. In a SPAC scenario, Essentially, the shell company is acquiring an operating company that will then be the surviving issuer as a public company. Because the shell company is already public, they may have already filed their first 10K. So that first year reprieve I talked about is no longer valid. There are a few exceptions to that. There may be some content in our slides here that can point you to some SEC guidance, but depending on the timing of a SPAC reverse merger, you may be able to avoid having to issue the report in the first 10K as a surviving issuer. But the point here is to highlight that to design a roadmap for SOX compliance, you need to understand which circumstances are applicable to you.
That's a good call out, Todd, with all the conversations around SPACs. I think it's important to understand that distinction. So thanks for bringing that out.
Absolutely. And so we talked a little bit about disclosure controls and procedures. So in order to certify under Section 302, even if a company is not going to evaluate its controls under Section 404A in the first year, the company will want to establish disclosure controls and procedures that allow them to certify what they're filing. So that usually entails establishing what we call a disclosure committee. So that's a group of individuals that are directly involved in the financial reporting and filing process. Maybe a combination of folks from finance and accounting, as well as legal and some members of the business, to make sure that everything that's going on in the business is being summarized appropriately and fairly presented in the quarterly and annual filings with the SEC, subject to the specific requirements of that company based on its filing status. Then we usually see a control process where internal stakeholders sign what we call a 302 sub-certification, where essentially they're confirming that they've disclosed everything to the accounting team that needs to be known to ensure that transactions are properly accounted for. They've reported any accounting errors or control breakdowns that they're familiar with. They've shared all relevant contracts and agreements with the accounting team so that they can be accounted for. And that ultimately gives the CEO and the CFO, those who are certifying, the comfort that they can go ahead and do so.
Thanks, Todd. And as I look at this next slide, right, there's a lot of what I think will be new to emerging organizations who may have had some history in managing some level of internal control. But as you get into the specifics of SOX, there's a lot of very, very particular definitions and issues that have to be raised. Covered a few of them here on this slide. Are the ones that you want to call out for a specific focus for newer organizations?
Yeah, I think that when you think about building a readiness plan, it's really important to scope your compliance program appropriately, right? So you'll hear auditors talking about taking a risk-based approach. And to do that, you really need to understand what is material to your financial statements, and you need to determine what entities or business segments are in scope for SOX purposes based on that materiality. And from there, you basically deconstruct the financial statements to determine which accounts need to be in scope based on that materiality, and then map all your business processes and IT controls to those in-scope accounts to make sure that you're evaluating the relevant controls. The point here is not to test and evaluate every single control that may be in operation at the company. It's to determine what controls are key based on what's material to their financial statements.
And that's a really good point, Todd. I think there's oftentimes a fear that this is really opening up the universe of every control, but it's not. And Terry, maybe I could bring you in here. You're living through this now. You're having to work on this in an organization that's getting ready for a significant event. How do you think about getting ready for this?
Thank you, Aidan. I think one of the biggest changes on the technology side of the house is in the years leading up to getting ready for SOX, you're doing materiality assessments, you're understanding your risks, you're figuring out your scope. Not much changes there except the level of granularity. But I think on the technology side, the big wake-up call is moving from just evaluating the control design, which most people may be familiar with as doing a walkthrough with your internal and or external auditors, pulling a sample of one to validate the control really does what we think it does. The big change that I've seen is when you start testing operating effectiveness, that can be brutal for engineering, security, IT, and other technology teams. They're just not necessarily prepared to pull the entire population, let's say, of changes or access grants that have happened over a complete fiscal year, and getting a relevant sample of high-risk changes or access grants or other areas can be a lot of work, and it can seem very picky to technologists because they're looking at their dashboards and their instrumentation for how they run the business on a daily basis. And here come the auditors to say, it's not good enough that you're logging this. I need a screenshot with a timestamp of that specific change. And I see from your process that you say you take 4 steps here, but I only see 3 steps listed in the evidence. Explain why that is. So I think that's a big shift, and that's one of the areas where when I help companies with public company readiness on the technology side, that's where I try to lean in as early as possible to say, we're not here yet, but let's talk through what it would look like in this sample of evidence you've given me. What would pass muster with our auditors and what would not? And that gives your technologists early warning of where they can leverage their existing technology, dashboards, instrumentation, et cetera, to hopefully produce the evidence that the auditors are looking for in the format and on the frequency that they're looking for, rather than making it a completely out-of-band ask, taking them away from their core responsibilities.
And Terry, today,
Sorry, it sounds like we're having technical difficulties there.
Well, I think take over there. I guess what Aidan was likely to ask me is where would we start to focus? And Todd will speak to in a moment to the entity level controls and the business process controls, which are of course the key elements of SOX from a financial reporting perspective. But I'll talk briefly about the Information Technology General Controls, or ITGCs, as they're often referred to. There are 4 key areas here, sometimes sliced into 3, sometimes sliced into 4, but I think of them as changes to systems, that is your core change management functions. Are there approval for your changes before they go live in production? Have those changes been tested before they go live? And is there an understanding of the separation of duties between various roles? Do you work in an environment where it's fair to allow some of your DevOps engineers to have access to production as well as write code? Do you have an environment where you have more separation there and you restrict developers from accessing code? Certainly in the engineering first cloud native worlds that I work in, it's very difficult to find ways to build effective change management that aligns with modern agile software development practices, and finding a way to incorporate those controls into the CI/CD pipeline can be one of the areas where you either face a lot of pain because of SOX, or you find ways to take credit for the good work that engineers and DevOps folks and security folks are already practicing. Another one is access to systems and data. When you're free public, you probably have a less restrictive approach to access. You may even have a very open environment in which you say, hey, anyone in engineering by default gets access to whatever repo they want, whatever code repository they want. And that's an area that can feel uncomfortable as you start locking things down, as you start restricting access to certain privileged roles, as you start requiring people to sign off and having their managers sign off that, yes, this person really does need that high level of access. And then certainly repeating that on a regular basis, on a quarterly basis, doing an access review of who has what roles. It can be challenging. It can feel restrictive when you've gone from a sort of freewheeling startup environment in which everything's open and everyone can work on whatever code they want. It can feel like a different company almost as you go through that maturization. And then finally, computer operations, which is maybe a old-fashioned word for the ability to back up and restore data. I like to drill into that one early because, frankly, that gives you the opportunity to address other areas like, the best defense against ransomware, other than having good perimeter controls and access controls, et cetera, is really knowing that you can recover your data when necessary. And from a SOX perspective, you absolutely need to be able to recover the financial data, not just the ultimate reporting, but all the pieces and parts, the pipelines, the joins, the algorithms that allow you to take data from source systems to the actual financial reporting that you're giving out to the street. And that can be tough because even if you start early on your ITGCs, you really need to work hand in hand with the business side of the house to get those data integrity controls right, to make sure you're not just monitoring your data pipelines, but also the consistency, the accuracy, the integrity of the data within those pipelines. So since that's so germane to financial reporting, maybe that's a great place for me to hand it over to Todd.
Yeah, thanks, Terry. I think that what we're highlighting here are some of the key areas of focus to start looking at from a readiness perspective, like Terry alluded to. I think it's important to think about the evolution of controls, right? SOX compliance is not just about a one and done exercise. It's an ongoing program. And so there should be a focus on continuous improvement, but there also should be consideration of how a company's culture and size is evolving, right? As an emerging growth company becomes larger and has more resources in place to have more efficient controls, using automation and avoiding controls that are necessary simply to review and monitor the activities of those who may be special or privileged users in the systems, right? Like the examples that Terry spoke about. It's important to think that, what do you want to get out of your compliance program? Are you merely trying to check the compliance box, or do you want to use the evaluation of internal controls to make things better, to make processes more efficient, to really optimize what the controls are doing? We got a question in the chat that asked about, what about looking at controls that are deemed key but not material? Would you recommend looking at those? Well, ultimately, that's sort of a question of how you want to implement your compliance program. I've seen lots of companies test controls that maybe aren't necessarily key for the purposes of SOX. In other words, their external auditor may not view the controls as key, but management wants to keep them in the SOX program so that they're getting comfort that these complementary controls are still working effectively. So I think that's ultimately a judgment call for management to make. You want to strike the right balance between deploying your resources to test controls, whether that's in-house resources or external resources like our teams at Armanino, and you want to be efficient, right? So deciding what are the top priorities and focusing your testing on those controls. You can capture non-key controls as part of your control universe in what we call a risk and control matrix, but you don't necessarily have to test them, or you don't necessarily have to test them to the same extent that you would your key controls. So there's lots of room for applying professional judgment in terms of how you handle those kinds of controls. It is really helpful to actually document your non-key controls in case you have a failure in any of your key controls, right? So you may be able to then call upon that non-key control and test it to get some additional comfort if you had a breakdown in one of your other controls. We wanted to...
I was going to say, Todd, just picking up on that, one of the questions I think that the audience will
have around is what should they expect? What in terms of the extra resource commitment, the extra time commitment that they would likely expect? And I think from your standpoint, Todd, you've seen a number of organizations go through this. Terry, you're living this now. So maybe some comments around what should organizations expect to have to do in terms of their commitment.
Yeah, it certainly is a big time commitment, and it all goes back to scoping, right? So when you define what would be in scope for your SOX program, you then want to identify who are the process owners and the control owners, right, that are accountable for owning those processes and controls. And as part of a readiness assessment and the discovery and documentation of the control environment, right, companies need to produce narratives and flowcharts and a risk and control matrix consistent with what their external auditors would expect to see to understand and evaluate the company's control environment. There is a multi-step process, right, where you're going to attend walkthroughs, or what I'll call talkthroughs, where you're just capturing everything that happens in the end-to-end process, right? Identifying the class of transactions that occur within the process, considering the risks along the end-to-end process, and then understanding what controls are in place to mitigate those risks if applicable. And if there aren't any, then documenting the gap and figuring out what the remediation plan should be. So that's a handful of hours per person to attend those meetings with the internal auditors, and ultimately perhaps the external auditors in the future. Creating the documentation, again, whether that's done in-house or with the help of advisors, takes a significant amount of time. Even if you hire folks to support you with the preparation of the documentation, the process owners and the control owners would still want to be involved in reviewing it to make sure it's complete and accurate and appropriately describes the end-to-end process. As you move from year one to year two, just want to add one other point. This is when you start testing your controls, right, under a traditional IPO scenario. Terry started to allude to how the sample sizes can be a little overwhelming for folks who haven't been through this kind of audit before. And this is where your time commitment increases, right, because you're going to be dealing with quarterly audits potentially, or multiple rounds of testing at least, right, where you're pulling samples from those periods. And that's going to take, several hours. And when you add it up annually, right, it could be, a week or two of work for process owners, particularly those who may own multiple controls.
Thanks, Todd. And Terry, I was going to ask you to comment on that, and that as somebody who's going through that right now, and you alluded to, and you made a comment earlier about shifting the organizational view a little bit around from the day-to-day work that they're doing to now looking at it through a different lens. How do you manage that transition? How do you get people to engage and commit appropriately and recognize the time that they got to put into this?
Thanks, Aidan. And in fact, we had a question somewhat related to this about the hours we list here per control. I think the attempt is that this is an aggregate number, but I will say it's tough to speak to that from the technology perspective, because from the technology perspective, you are likely to be spending a lot of time preparing people. And by that I mean, yes, you're only going to, let's say, pull a discrete control owner into an hour-long meeting with your auditors, but certainly I've found success in helping those control owners prepare through a series of taking existing documentation they have, and by that I mean technical design documentation, architectural documentation, data diagrams, process flows, things like that, and making our own version of it that is really narrowly focused on SOX compliance or compliance in general if you're complying with multiple frameworks. Because I think that gives us the opportunity to refine things into the language that auditors are expecting, and gives us the opportunity to focus on the areas where we know there are key control points, rather than just sort of flooding the auditors with a whole bunch of extraneous documentation that they don't really need and could just cause more questions than it really answers. So to answer that directly, I think these might be the core hours that you're thinking about per control but that's really the tip of the iceberg. I think there's a lot of work that happens behind the scenes, at least on the technology side, to host office hours, to meet sometimes one-on-one with key control owners and their managers and their management chain to help them understand why this needs to be prioritized against other work, and to help them prepare for the meetings with auditors. I have been in more than one walkthrough session where the auditors will ask an engineer whether or not a certain practice is robust, and engineers will tend to go deep into the details and tell you all the warts and all view of how a service can be finicky and flaky. And as I say, that may create more heat than light in terms of an answer for the auditors. So I tend to spend a lot of time in that transition from year one to year two, workshopping with our engineering and technology control owners to help them understand that there is an uplift coming in terms of the number of hours required to actually prove our compliance with these controls. And there's a certain approach we want to take to make sure that we're not wasting their time, which is valuable to the company, and we're able to act as the tip of the spear from a compliance perspective and provide most of the information we can directly to our auditors. And if they need additional information from our engineers, we let them meet with them. But I think that most of the things, sharing policy, sharing process documentations, that's a great opportunity to get your compliance team involved early. And it serves two functions. It helps protect the engineers and technologists from being pulled into meetings and getting a whole bunch of requests that, frankly, they're not likely to be a huge fan of. And it also helps your compliance team start to get a better and deeper understanding of the architecture, the processes, the data flows, and your overall technical environment.
And that's a nice segue into where we want to go next with this. I think you both painted a picture of shifting the organization's perspective, adding a whole new layer of conversations and engagement that's potentially different than where the organization has before. So let's talk a little bit about how do you start and when do you start? And generally, best practice suggests that you're starting 12 to 18 months out before you have an event, and then leading into that. Todd, Terry, your thoughts around what are you seeing with organizations out there that are starting to get ready for this?
I guess I've seen tale of two cities, so to speak. Those that are contemplating a traditional IPO, I see taking steps early to try to assess readiness early, and that's a good thing because once you go public, right on day one, you need to operate as a public company under these requirements, even if you're not certifying for SOX in your first 10K. In the SPAC scenario, companies are under a compressed timeline and they're really under pressure. Usually they're just struggling to get through their multi-year audit where their financials need to be audited under PCAOB standards in time for the S4 filing with the SEC. And so it's very difficult to prioritize focus on controls. And so that may come after the event happens, and then the company will really be pressed to get the right controls in place. Usually the companies that are going through the SPAC process are smaller, right? They're really resource constrained on their teams, both in terms of finance and accounting as well as IT. And so it is a challenge for them to evaluate readiness and get controls in place. The transition to the PCAOB level audit can be a rude awakening for them. Terry, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it can be a tough balance because you need technology leaders who understand the uplift that's required. And frankly, a lot of startups don't have those technology leaders who have been through this pain before and have realized how early you need to start. So I've frequently seen on the technology side of the house, it's a little late. It's usually something we think about after we go public, and I think that's a challenge. That's really shooting yourself in the foot. I'm very privileged at Instacart to work for I report to the VP of Infrastructure Engineering, who was previously the head of cloud engineering at Slack. So he's been through the IPO process, and he's seen how this can go well and how it cannot go well. So I'm very lucky that he created the governance, risk, and compliance function early here, which has given us the opportunity to meet with control owners early, to figure out who the control owners are, et cetera. So we are certainly, we're further ahead than a lot of startups or high growth companies. And I think if you don't have someone on the technology side of the house who is a strong supporter of starting early, that's a great place to start. It could be your chief information security officer, it could be your CIO, it could just be a VP of engineering in a really relevant spot like advertising or data or product delivery. Make sure you meet with them and make sure you chat with them about, give them an unvarnished view of the uplift required and help them understand that it's not going to be fun for anyone if we delay this too long.
Let me just pick up on that, Terry, if I might, and really as part of the evolution of the organization and the change in the conversations that happened inside. You and I have talked about this before, where many of the organizations will have gone through some control work prior to this. Oftentimes it's around getting a SOC 2 review, or we call out some of the specific frameworks here that are typically more technology control biased, but they are controls, they are internal controls, and there are some processes that are put in place in the organization. How do you think about organizations that have gone through that work, and so they have a sense of having completed that work, having built good general IT controls? What's the lift then in going from that to getting more focused on the SOX controls, particularly the SOX business controls?
Right. I think the biggest challenge can be folks who've gone through something like PCI, which is a prescriptive framework, and it really only has a low bar in terms of proving out that you've complied. You need to show that at a point in time you have done certain activities. Have I locked down this port? Have I separated the duties between who has access in our core CDN, our card holder environment versus our corporate network, and things like that. And I think folks who've been through that process, or maybe they've been through a SOC 2, which, to be frank, today you can do very quickly and easily, given the number of tools out there that help you pull data and give you a sort of checklist approach to do these 20 things and you'll pass your SOC 2 audit. That can be very helpful for startups who just may not have a GRC function yet. They may not have the focus here to spend a lot of time and effort on getting compliant with SOC 2 or PCI. And I think it surprises them. There's a significant difference from being able to prove something once over the course of a year, and for PCI, for example, where prescriptively you know exactly what you need to do and you know what the auditor or QSA is going to be asking you. And then comes SOX, and you have a lot higher bar for evidence. You need to prove, you tend to take approaches with your external auditors that are not just positive testing, but negative testing. And by that I mean, not only prove that this happened, but prove to me that it couldn't happen any other way, that you really have robust controls over those systems. That, I think, is where the biggest surprise comes in, and where, once again, it behooves us all who work in compliance to have those conversations early so you can limit the amount of surprise.
And that's a good point, Terry, around that distinction between some of the more prescriptive, framework-driven controlled work and moving into something that is a lot more robust and has a lot more material impact as you look to the financial markets. I've heard you talk about, and I think you use the term tentpoles, right? Pick a few areas where, particularly in the ITGC area, where you can start to build upon the existing controls that are in place and then demonstrate those more clearly. Talk a little bit, if you would, about how do you pick those and why are they important? How do you make sure that you're choosing the right ones?
Absolutely, Aidan. I think maybe I use the analogy tent poles because SOX can be a circus, and putting up the big circus tent all at once can be really challenging. What you can do is you can pick a few key areas and drill in deeply so that you sort of have a ripple effect out from that one area to help folks understand what the uplift really is here and what the bar to pass your SOX audit is going to be. So some of the areas I pick tend to be change management. Startups will index more heavily on speed and keeping costs down. And by that I mean we want to iterate quickly. We want to be agile and ship code as quickly as possible so that we can get feedback from our customers, be they internal or external, on did we hit the mark? Is this what we want to do? How do we iterate to improve this, et cetera? That can seem to be at odds with what SOX asks us to do for change management controls. Often when you speak with your DevOps folks or your engineering VPs, and you start to describe the fact that I need to prove that every change has been approved, quote unquote, by management prior to being released to production. What does that mean in a modern CI/CD environment? If you're releasing code 5 times a day, how do you implement that control without slowing down the speed of release? How do you find the right level of friction so that people are conscientious and aware of how changing a feature can impact financial reporting without turning compliance into the Department of Profit Prevention? Another area which I touched on before is access control. It can feel restrictive. It can feel like you're going from working at a fun startup to a restrictive, big enterprise environment when you start locking things down and you start requiring that people sign off and get their manager to approve before they get access to certain areas, before they are able to do certain functions and features that previously everyone was able to do. That's a culture shift. And I think you need to go into that eyes open, and you need to have the tone at the top with the engineering leadership to really explain why this is necessary and what benefits we get out of it. And as I mentioned before, the getting more serious about your data recovery controls and your IT security controls, you probably have really smart people working on this, but they may not be doing the best job of documenting the activities they're taking. And when the auditors come to ask for evidence, they may have a good story to tell, but they may not have the rigor of documenting how we responded to this incident. What actions did we take or not take? How did we document an emergency change? We had to break glass and we had to give developers access to production to fix this critical incident. Did we do a good job of documenting all that so that when auditors come back in a year and say, hey, I'm going to pick this interesting incident, it seems like an emergency change, but I looked at the ticket and there's not a lot of detail here. It seems like you're not following your own policy. And I think that's a key point. At the core, an audit is just a measurement of the distance between what is said and what is done. So if you create policies that you can't follow, you're just setting yourselves up for failure. Find the right level of controls that make sense for your environment where you are today, have a justification for it, and then make sure you can follow them regularly.
So just to that point, Terry, you mentioned the evidence a couple of times now, right? Being able to not only do the thing that you're supposed to do, but showcase that you are doing it. And when I think about the technology that you use to support that, you're a great Hyperproof customer. We appreciate that. And you're utilizing Hyperproof to support that evidence management function and making sure that it's available to the auditors when they come in. How important is having a central place to work, a central repository, a technology tool that supports that kind of work that you're doing?
I am delighted. I've been working in SOX compliance on the technology side since SOX has been around, and one of the most painful pieces over the years has been screenshots. It is very difficult with a straight face to explain to engineers, IT, security, why a screenshot is better evidence than the core log files from their systems. I am delighted to see in the past, 5 to 7 years, this real blossoming of tools like Hyperproof that allow you to pull evidence directly from systems. I would much rather be able to pull evidence on a weekly, monthly, or daily basis to give my compliance team the opportunity to monitor those controls internally and get early warning when something is going off the rails. So I think technology is your friend here, and I think the barrier to entry in terms of price and implementation is an incredible ROI on the amount of time you're saving from, frankly, expensive software engineering resources. So I'm a huge fan of using technology to pull data wherever you can from those systems, and to use native work tools that engineers are used to when you can use a JIRA ticket rather than email to assign out those evidence collection duties, for example.
Good. Thanks, Terry. I appreciate that. And I think as we come to the top of our time here, I do want to touch upon just some of the roles that compliance software can play in helping that readiness, helping ensure the organization can be effective and efficient in its use of resources. So I've already alluded to gathering evidence, having it in one place, having controls in one place, having the ability to task. Terry, you made the point about being able to extract evidence automatically, for instance. That's got to be a huge time saver, so you're not adding additional tasks onto the already overburdened engineer's calendar. When you think about the order of operations there, how do you think about where should you start? Imagine you recognize that you do want to have some central organizing principle, a central organizing platform around the SOX work that you're going to do. Any advice for the audience around where to start?
Sure. I think one of the challenges early on is finding out when and how to devote your technology compliance resources to being involved with the business process and financial risk analysis. It's super important that you understand what is in scope for SOX, because frankly, SOX at the core is about financial reporting, and the risks are about financial reporting. So there's a little bit of translation that has to be done between the financial reporting risks and the technology controls that you need to implement, test, and monitor. So working closely with your partners like Todd here, and finding out from them, either directly being in their business process walkthroughs, which can be a time investment, but I think it gives you an early warning when a certain system is being brought into scope, or at least finding a way to regularly sync with them so that you understand, hey, when we started a few months ago, system XYZ was not in scope, but we're making more money through that system now, and it's generating revenue, and we need to recognize that revenue, and thus it's now an important key area of SOX. Having that early sync, presenting a unified front between financial compliance and IT compliance to the business so that they understand there are two halves to this equation and we need to work closely, gives you a lot of benefits down the road. And then you can get into the nitty-gritty of how do we publish standards for evidence? How do we build internal monitoring of controls so that no one's surprised when the auditors find a deviation or an exception? And how do you really take advantage of automation so that you're reducing the time being asked of your technologists, and you're giving the business process side of the house early warning when a system that they are relying upon for an ITAC or an IT automated control is having problems, or maybe it doesn't work the way they thought it did. Maybe it doesn't have the controls in place they assumed it did. Todd, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that from a systems perspective, one of the biggest challenges is often with emerging growth companies, you have system administrators that sit within the business functions, right? And so you alluded to some of the segregation of duties challenges earlier, Terry. And I think that that's one of the most common ones we see. So thinking about that up front and how you can control that access will eliminate a big concern from the external auditors. it also will reduce the amount of that documentation you're talking about, right, in terms of proving that something didn't go wrong when it could have. I think it's also important to note that when we were talking about the other IT frameworks where companies may have already evaluated compliance, it mentioned this on the slide, but we didn't touch on it, and that's that usually when you're doing a SOC 2 or another type of compliance framework, it's on systems that are client-facing, but not necessarily the systems that are relevant to your company's financial reporting. So you may have a SOC 1 audit, but that's focused on controls that are relevant to your customer's financial reporting, not your own financial reporting. So hopefully some of the controls and the processing controls can be leveraged as you try to adopt and implement SOX. But there may be distinctions, right? The customer-facing platforms may or may not directly impact revenue, and if they don't, they probably won't need to be in scope for SOX. If they do, they will need to be in scope for SOX. This is where usually companies will have better controls on the engineering side, right? They're going to have some change management process, even if it isn't as formally documented as you'd like to see from a control perspective. But getting the same level of rigor implemented on the financial reporting systems is essential for SOX.
Good. Thanks, Todd. I think we're coming to the end of our main content here. I know that we do have some questions. Aaron, can I hand those questions back to you?
Absolutely, no problem. Let me just say thanks for this presentation, and I want to let everyone know about the slides before I go into the questions. If you want a copy of the slides that you've just seen, you can download them from the drop-down menu on the bottom left-hand side of your screen. Okay, let's get to some questions that have come in. Can you give your view of duplicate controls? You're looking at, do you feel the control needs to be duplicated for each IT app? This person is asking questions about a SPAC and legacy RCMs and wants to know about duplicate controls and your thoughts on them.
Yeah, I saw the question. So they're asking about 100 plus controls specifically around system access. That does sound very unusual and probably unnecessary. I do want to distinguish between what we'd call a general control, where you're provisioning access or modifying access for an existing employee or removing access for a terminated employee, right? Ideally, those processes would all be centralized. They're not necessarily required to be, but from a compliance perspective, it's much more efficient and cost-effective to be able to test one common process for those controls rather than have to test separate processes for each system. So in other words, if you have different administrators for the different in-scope financial reporting systems, and those administrators are the ones that grant access to the system, that would not be a common process, right? You might have to test it separately. But I do want to distinguish between that as a general control and what we might call out at the business process level related to specific restricted access scenarios. So you may have key controls, for example, that call out segregation of duties enforcement, right? That take the procure to pay process, right? You may call out a restricted access control that says no one individual can create a vendor or modify a vendor in the system and create a PO and process an invoice, right? So that would be a restricted access control that's called out. If you're talking about those types of system access controls, again, 100 sounds unusually high to me, but you might see those as part of the business process key controls. The only other reason I would think for a high number of system access controls is, like I said, if the processes are decentralized. There's no specific requirement to centralize them, but like I said, it's much more efficient to do so.
Yeah, I'd call out that if you're inheriting your RCMs that have been prepared, perhaps by a consulting firm or something like that for you, it is likely that they took the approach of going system by system, and that's probably why you're seeing what appear to be duplicate controls. They probably haven't taken the top-down view of what is our change management process? What is our core access control process? So it's an unfortunate byproduct of the way SOX tends to be approached initially, and I don't know that there's a way to avoid that pain, but I think you called out a great point, which is one of the ways the compliance team can help, is to start aggregating those points of common controls and finding where, all of our code repos are in GitHub and we have branch protection on, and we can take credit for that as a centralized control. And then to Todd's point, maybe there are individual functions and features related to the ITAC for the business processes that do require additional levels of control. But let's reduce that 100 plus controls to the areas where we do have commonality.
One reason that a company may prefer to disaggregate their controls like that is because they think that if there's a failure, they can isolate the failure to that system while still being able to rely on the other controls for the other systems. Again, it really boils down to how is the process designed. If it's really a centralized process, but you're just disaggregating it for presentation purposes, well, then that's sort of semantics, right? If you had a control failure in a common process, it really should be considered across all systems because it could have been any one of the systems. If it's a decentralized process, then sure, there is some slight benefit in terms of not having to assess the potential impact of a deficiency on the other systems that weren't impacted. But I think that benefit is outweighed by the costs associated with not only managing the processes that way, but auditing them separately, right? Because if you have a separate provisioning process for every system, that's 25 to 45 samples you might be pulling a year, assuming you have that high volume of new users. If you don't, then you're probably going to be testing the full population for each system.
Great, thanks. There are a bunch of other questions that were asked here. We're going to have to have them answered offline. We're close to time here, and I want to respect everyone's time and was listening to this webcast. I want to thank everyone for participating and listening. I want to thank the speakers today, Todd Bishop, Terry O'Daniel, and Aidan Collins. And I'd like to give a special thanks to Hyperproof for making this webcast possible. Once again, to obtain your CPE credit for this presentation, please disable your pop-up blockers in order to access the exam. The webcast will close automatically and the final examination will be presented in a separate window. If you have trouble viewing the CPE test or receiving the CPE certificate, please send an email to webcasts@complianceweek.com.